Any of you familiar with the name Jeff Bezos? Jeff Bezos? No one's heard of Jeff? What about Amazon.com? Any Prime members out there? Right? Yeah, 2-day shipping? Yeah. Jeff Bezos actually founded Amazon.com in 1994 as an online bookstore. At the time, it was completely run out of his garage in Bellevue, Washington. So Amazon.com started in a garage. He sold his first book in July of 95 and issued his IPO 2 years later in 97. Today, Amazon.com is the world's largest online retailer. Steve Jobs, you familiar with that name? All right. Anyone with an Apple device should know Steve Jobs. In 1976, Steve Jobs started Apple Computers by selling 50 units of the Apple I computer at $500 a piece to a local retailer. Jobs took the purchase order to a parts distributor and ordered the parts, and then built 50 computers in 30 days from a garage in Cupertino, California. So Apple Computers started in a garage. Today, Apple is the most valuable tech company in the world. About 45 minutes down the road from there, or from Disneyland Park in Anaheim, California, there's a house in Los Angeles where the Walt Disney Company got its start. Anyone ever been to Disney World? Any Disney Worlders out there, right? We've all been impacted. Every one of us in this room has been impacted by Walt Disney at some level, at some point, every one of us. In 1923, the house belonged to Walt Disney's uncle, Robert Disney. Walt and his brother, Roy, moved in with their uncle to set up the first Disney studio in the one-car garage out back. So they started filming the Alice comedies, which was part of the original Alice's Wonderland. Today, Disney is the highest-grossing media conglomerate in the world. Started in a garage behind someone's house. One more for you. Stanford graduates, students Larry Page and Sergey Brin started what was known as Google from a woman's garage in September of 1998. Soon the project was interfering with their schoolwork, so they tried to sell it to Excite for $1 million. Excite rejected the offer, and now Google is the most trafficked website in the world. And so humans, as you see, have the capacity. Like we as human beings, we have the capacity to take something very small and develop something very big, don't we? And these are just a few examples of the bigger things. Okay, this small little garage where Steve Jobs says, hey, let's build a different type of computer, took something very, very small, not very much money, not very much space, and look what, really, Apple has impacted almost all of our lives. Even if you're an Android user, okay, you Android users out there, Apple's impacted your life, okay? There are so many things that we do as a result of Steve Jobs or Walt Disney or we even have terms. When you Google something, you'll know what that means, right? It means you're doing a web search. Let me Google that. Go Google your name sometime. Okay, so for those of you that aren't internet people, we've developed even terms for this. Why? Because someone with an idea, someone with a desire, didn't have very much, had very, very little, but they had a garage and an idea and a little bit of money, and they were able to do something very significant with that. Now, this is not a motivational speech for you to go out and start businesses in your garage this morning, okay? But if we as human beings have the capacity, the God-given capacity to take what's in our hands and to build and accomplish things, how much more can God take what you have and use it for His mission and His purposes? So go with me to Exodus chapter 4, where we'll find ourselves this morning. Exodus chapter 4. We saw last week how God appeared to Moses in a burning bush and called Moses to deliver the Israelite people from bondage out of the hand of the Egyptians. And last week we noticed how when God calls someone, that God will promise himself to accomplish that task. So that great things are not accomplished by the ones who are called, but rather great things are accomplished by the one who calls. And so here we find Moses still in this conversation with God. And to bring you up to speed, God is getting ready to deliver his people as a result of his promise that he made to Abraham. So, by way of review, what were the three things that God promised to Abraham hundreds of years earlier? God says, Abraham, I'll make of you a great nation. So he promised him, or he says, go into the land that I'll promise you, and I'll make of you a great nation. So Abraham was promised a land which would be an eternal possession, a place of restored fellowship with God. He says, I will promise you offspring. From you will come nations. A people enjoying a restored fellowship with God. And then he promised Abraham blessing, that there would actually come one from your seed, Abraham, who would provide an opportunity for those who have been broken by sin to have a restored fellowship with God. And so God's covenantal promises to Abraham are at the center of what God's doing with Moses and the nation of Israel in what we talked in week 1 of as redemptive history. God's story of redeeming his people and calling back his children to a renewed fellowship with him, to an ultimate place of restored fellowship with him. And so remembering the covenantal promise he made to Abraham of a land, of an offspring, of blessing, God now comes to Moses hundreds of years later and says, Moses, get up and go to Egypt, and I will choose you to be the one that will deliver them. And so Moses had some questions for God. And God reveals himself as the one who is the great I am, and that's where we ended last week, where Moses says, God, who shall I tell them is sending me? And God says, tell them the great I am has sent you. The one who is all-powerful, the one who is self-existent, the one who is eternal, the one who needs nothing from anybody, the almighty God of the universe will accomplish this. Moses, tell them that. That wasn't enough for Moses. And we can be hard on Moses and be like, oh, come on, Moses, God's talking to you. Like, just believe him. Yet there's so much of Moses in us. There's so much hesitation. There's so much, God, maybe you picked the wrong person. In fact, what a lot of Christians feel is that maybe someone else should do that job. So you've heard the statistic, right? What percentage of the church body actually does the work of the church? What do you think? Maybe 50%, generally 10% of the church body does 100% of the work. Now, I don't think that's true in our church. I think it's probably a little higher than that. But even if it was, say let's give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. If the average church is, if there's 10% doing 100% of the work, I think we're above average. I think we are. I think our church has emphasized ministry really effectively over the years. But say, let's give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. Say we're at 50%. That's a lot better than 10. But even if we're at 50%, that means there's half of our church not engaged in the mission. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, because being engaged in the mission can look different from individual to individual. There are some people that don't have the capacity to do, or even the health to do, what other people can do. But God's calling each of us to something, isn't he? Now, God's not calling all of you to stand up here and proclaim the word on Sunday morning. God's not calling all of you to serve teaching a class. God's not calling all of you to serve, so oftentimes we look at the more visible areas of service. But God's calling you to something. It's not okay to not do anything. God's called you into his mission just as he was calling Moses. God is calling you. If you're a child of God, God is coming to you saying, I have a mission for you. This is what it is, or find out what it is and do that. But what we find within particularly mainstream kind of evangelical Christianity is we like what we like. And what we like is for people to serve us, don't we? How many of you like to be served? Raise your hand. Yeah, and if your hand's not raised, you're a liar. And you need to come forward and get that right because you love to be served. I love to be served. I don't always like to serve. And oftentimes when we serve, it's kind of like, well, what does it benefit me? What am I going to get out of it? And this is just the tendency of human nature, isn't it? Who's going to serve me? Nobody's serving me, and then we get frustrated, and then when God calls us to ministry or there's opportunity for service and opportunity to engage in the mission, it's like, let someone else do that, right? Well, someone else will do that. Well, maybe God's calling you to do it. And so we can stand here and say, God is amazing, God is awesome, God, the great I am is going to do crazy, amazing, awesome things if we'll just believe that, and that's true. And then God says, oh, but I want you to go. Excuse me, God? No, yeah, I want you to give. Then it gets personal, and this is where Moses is. Because Moses, in chapter 4, answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. Now, I want to be real sympathetic with Moses here. If I'm in Moses' shoes, I'm heading back to Israelites and say, hey, Israelites, God showed up and talked to me, and he told me all, 600,000 of you are going to get to leave Egypt and be delivered from your slavery. Who's coming with me? Come on. It's like, who's the crazy guy, Like there's been a lot of crazy people that have done a lot of crazy things in the name of God, right? So, it's like, it's great, God. You and I are having this conversation, but they're going to think I'm crazy. Like as soon as some nut job gets up and says, hey, God told me to do this, all of a sudden we're like, yeah, right. God didn't tell you nothing. So that's what Moses is like, God, they're going to think I'm crazy. So God turns to Moses, and he asks him a really, really powerful question. And the Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? Interesting question, isn't it? Was Moses called to do something pretty incredible? Yes, he was. Was Moses going to need a lot of help and power from the God of the universe? Yes. Was Moses scared? I bet he was. Was Moses concerned? Obviously so. And so what God does is really interesting. He turns to Moses and says, Moses, what's in your hand? Moses says, a staff. It's a stick. I got a rod. I use it as a shepherd. It's what shepherds have. It's a staff. That's it. That's what Moses had in his hand. And God said to him, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. I guess so. How many of you love snakes? How many of you are running from the snake? When I am out of there. I'm God. I'm like, see you, God. All right, my staff becoming a snake. No, thank you. All right, this just got. Not only are you asking me to deliver the Israelites, now I have to deal with snakes. No. And so Moses, I love the text. Moses ran. He's like, staff on the ground, snake. Woo! He probably screamed. You know what I mean? And ran. Like that's me. Not a fan of the whole snake thing. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. At this point, I'm like, no. God, you're asking too much. No. Don't tell God no. But Moses said no when God speaks. So Moses put out his hand and caught it. and it became a staff in his hand. And God says that they may believe that Yahweh, the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has appeared to you. So, what God is doing for Moses is saying, I get it, Moses. It's a large task. I get it. If you just show up, they're probably not going to believe you. So guess what, Moses? I'm going to take whatever's in your hand, and I'm going to use it to do some amazing things. You ever thought Moses thought like it's a staff? It's a staff. That's all it is. It's a piece of wood that I found and made into my staff. God says, I'll take that. I'll take what's in your hand if you'll give it to me, and I will use it so that, why? So that the people will believe that the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has appeared to you. And so when God calls his people to mission and God calls his people to service, understand that he can take whatever's in your hand and he can use it exponentially to accomplish whatever it is that he wants to accomplish. But what we have to do is we have to live like this, not like this. How many of us live like this? God, I don't have much, and most of us don't have much, and I'm not even talking in the terms of money or finances. I'm just talking in terms of what do you have? And Moses had a staff. God said, give me the staff, and I'll do amazing signs and wonders through that so people will believe. That God could take what's in your hand, that God can take what you have. I don't know what it is, an ability, a talent, a time, a gift. I don't know, but to take it and the fact that God could multiply it and do amazing things through it. He took the staff and it became a snake. God uses Moses' empty hand. Look what he says here. Again, the Lord said in verse 6, put your hand inside your cloak. He put his hand in his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. So he puts it in, takes it out, his hand has leprosy, this disease all over it. And then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Verse 8, if they will not believe you, God said, or listen to the first sign, they may believe the latter sign. And if they will not believe even those two signs, so God understands the skeptical human nature. God gets us, right? There will be some that will be like, all right, cool trick, Moses, with the staff. Okay, maybe the hand thing, okay, but that doesn't necessarily prove that God showed up to you. So God says, I'll assist you even more, and God just takes water. So I love what God does. God just takes everyday, ordinary things, and this is the way God works. He just takes average, ordinary, everyday things, a staff, an empty hand, water. He says, if they will not believe those two signs or listen to your voice, you shall take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground, and the water that you shall take from the Nile will become blood on the dry ground. So God says, Moses, if you have anything, average, ordinary person, using average, ordinary things, I can accomplish amazing and marvelous and incredible things through them. And so this is the power of what happens when God calls his people to mission. It's average, ordinary. Like how many of you view yourself as an average, ordinary person? Go ahead and raise your hand. My hand's in the air. Like not real special, not real well known, not real wealthy, just kind of an average person. And this was Moses. He was just tending sheep in the desert. They weren't even his sheep. They were his father-in-law. He was working for his father-in-law. How many of you work for your father-in-law? Don't raise your hand, right? Moses had a staff. He did. God says, in human terms, that doesn't look like a lot. But in the hands of the great I Am, you see, we serve a powerful God, don't we? We serve a God who can do exponentially more than we could ever dream or imagine if we will understand that it's his power that works through us, and God delights in using average, ordinary people to display his glory. He does it every day, all the time. And so when God calls individuals in a church to give and to engage, he takes what you have and he uses it. What we have to do is we have to open up our hands. We've got to be willing to take the step. But many of us are like Moses, aren't we? God just says, Moses, these 3 signs from these average, ordinary objects will be proof to the people that I am God and that I have appeared to you, and they will believe, Moses. So you have no more excuses. Let's go. Let's get it done. But Moses said to the Lord, he's not ready yet. Like he's still hesitating. Like how many of us have found ourselves there? I know you're amazing, God. I know you're powerful. I get all of that. I know you can do great things with me, but I am not eloquent. Either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue. Like, I don't talk good. I don't. I don't know if Moses had a stuttering problem or if he just couldn't articulate himself well or if he was just giving an excuse, but he's just like, God, I don't talk good. Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seen or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. Does God know that Moses isn't probably the most eloquent, articulate orator? Does God know that when he's calling? It's not like God's like, oh, I didn't know that, Moses. I didn't realize you're not a great speaker. God knows that. But what's God trying to do? God's trying to take someone who has a weakness, someone who is flawed, someone who is struggling. He says, I will be with you. I made your mouth, Moses. I will tell you what to speak. Moses, this isn't about you or your gifts or abilities. This is about my power to be displayed through you. And so what we find is that God chooses to use you in spite of your weaknesses. Like, God, I'm not very talented. Nope, you're not. I'm sorry. You're probably not. God, I just got a lot of struggles. Yeah, you do. I'm probably not the most qualified. Nope. But it's not about you, and it's not about any of that. It's about a God who in grace comes to you and says, in spite of your weaknesses, I want to do something in you. Because I'll be with you. And so even though Moses, in spite of his speech and that weakness, listen, okay, from a human perspective, if you're going to be a leader of thousands of people, it's probably helpful to be kind of eloquent. So we're going to enter into a presidential campaign, and it's going to drag on for the next however many months. We're going to hear a lot of speeches, and what are they working on? They're working on how well they deliver a speech. No one cares what's actually said in the speech. You guys realize that, right? It does matter, but most Americans are like, wow, he delivered that in an inspiring way. I'm going to vote for it, okay, right? Like, people that have the ability to inspire have the ability to move hearts. And we've seen that in politics a lot. And so if you're going to be a leader or even a political leader, it helps to be able to be. And so Moses is like, I can't, God. God says, I'll be with your mouth, teach you what to speak. So every time Moses has an excuse, every time Moses has a hesitation, God says, no, Moses, I'll take what's in your hand, whatever it is, I'll take it, I'll use it. I'll take average, ordinary people, average, ordinary things. I'll do exponentially amazing things through that. Well, yeah, but I'm not a good talker. Don't worry about that, Moses. Not about your speech, not about your weaknesses. It's about my power being displayed through you. I'll be with you. I'll tell you what to say. See, it's about God. It's about God's glory being displayed through weak vessels. So Moses is Moses is out of excuses, right? Like, who am I going to say is going to come? They won't believe me. I'm slow of speech. So excuse after excuse, God says, no, it's cool, Moses. I got that covered. I got that covered too. No, not a problem, Moses. So Moses gets to the end, and look what he says. I love it. Oh, my Lord, please send someone else. So we get down to the reality, don't we? Just let someone else do it, God. You got the wrong guy. Just send someone else. I know you'll be with me, and I know you'll tell me what to do, but what was being revealed here in Moses is like, God, at the end of the day, I just don't want to. Like, great idea, God. Love it. I'll pray. Here's what I'll do, God. I'll pray. I'll pray for that. Right? Like, man, there's a real big need over there. I'm gonna be praying for that. Like, and believe me, prayer changes the world. I believe that. But sometimes we hide behind certain platitudes and certain things we say rather than stepping forward because, God, just let someone else do it. Someone obviously more qualified than myself, someone more gifted than myself. Just let them do it, God. At the end of the day, Moses said, God, you know what? To be honest with you, I just don't want to. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was, I'm not gifted. He just says, God, send someone else. And we're good at doing that, right? We're good at seeing needs. We're good at seeing the mission and saying, someone else. And I love God because he's been so like patient with Moses. Like, in spite of his weakness, he says, no, Moses, I'm going to use you. But then verse 14 says, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. Now, my anger, if I'm God, my anger would have been kindled back in chapter 3. Like, hello, Moses, I'm God. Like, just do what I say because I'm God. Like, how many of you have had that conversation with your children? Why do I have to do that? Because I'm your father and I said to do it. That's the end of it, right? How many of you have had that conversation? How many of you have been on the other end of that conversation, right? Like, if I'm God, that's where I'm at. Moses, no, stop, Moses. I'm God, do it. But God is patient with him. Finally, Moses gets to the end and says, just send someone else, and God gets angry. Is it okay for God to get angry, yes or no? Yes. Is anger sin? No. It's how we react when we're angry that becomes sin. So the Bible says you can be angry and don't sin. So don't get the idea that God's just all about rainbows and lollipops, okay? God gets angry, just like you get angry. God has real wrath and real anger toward disobedience and toward sin. In fact, we're going to see some of that anger and that wrath unleashed on the Egyptians. That'll be a fun week. But I love a God who gets angry. I do. I love a God who's jealous for his promises and his plan. And I love a God who in righteous anger deals very graciously with his children. I love a God who's passionate about his glory and passionate about his children being a part of his plan. So verse 14, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Fine, Moses, you can't speak well? If I'm God, I'm like, forget it, Moses. I'll find someone else. Right? Is that what God does? No. In spite of God, his hesitation, in spite of his God send someone else, God's still saying, no, Moses. I'm angry, but I'm also gracious to you, and I'll work with you. So get your brother Aaron. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth. and with his mouth, and will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand what? Take the staff with which you shall do the signs. So God says, your brother Aaron, he speaks well. Tell him what to speak and let him speak. I'm still going to use you, Moses. And by the way, don't forget your staff, because that's going to be really important. Because I'm going to do amazing things through that staff that's in your hand. So no excuses. God in grace and mercy, I believe, says, Moses, you're part of my plan. And I want to use you. Then in spite of your hesitation, in spite of your weaknesses, in spite of your struggles, Moses, take a step. Step out in faith and trust me. That's all God's asking Moses to do. Trust me. Is it going to be easy? Nope. Are you equipped to handle it? Probably not. But you serve a God who is. And that's what God calls you to. That's what God calls his people to. Step out. Engage in the mission and watch him work. This is why through the years of youth ministry here at Faith, I've never been afraid to take a young person and thrust them into ministry even though they didn't want to. Like, I've had teenagers like, Doug, I don't think I can do that. I said, I know you don't. But if God's with you, you will. And then to watch them thrive in ministry and watch them thrive as God uses them and watch God transform and change their lives. I've seen it happen over and over and over with teenagers who hesitated, who didn't think they were talented enough, who didn't think they were good enough. Join ministry, engage in the mission, and God changed their lives. And so, as we move on in the story, I'm not going to lie to you. This next section gets a little weird, okay? But it's awesome. So verse 19, and you're all reading ahead like, what's coming up? We'll get there. Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive. And Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who are seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took, look at what's happening. Look at this verse here. Moses took what? The staff of God in his hand. Now, this, I just love this, all right? As a side note, as I'm studying, I'm reading through this. This is no longer just the staff. This is now the staff of God, right? Not even Moses' staff. Like, this is God's staff now. Okay, so Moses, what's in your hand? A staff? I'll take that. That's my staff now. I'm going to give it to you. You're going to do amazing things through it, you know? So, I mean, this is the way my mind works. It's just like, hey, Moses, what's that you got there? Nothing, just the staff of God. That's, okay. So, can God use what's in your hand? Yeah. Now it gets weird. Verse 24. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Okay, so God calls Moses, and Moses and God have this interaction. Finally, Moses says, okay, I'll go. They start heading out. They stop to lodge, and God shows up wanting to kill Moses. Does that make any sense to you? Like, what kind of a God is going to show up after calling Moses, after being merciful to him, after being gracious, saying, I'm going to use you, and now wants to kill him? I'm like, what is going on here? Why would God do that? Like, is God changing his mind? Is God... And honestly, it's texts like this that a lot of people have frustration with and struggle with, because they honestly say, what kind of a God would do that? Perhaps Moses was sick. Perhaps he was on the edge of dying. But the text and the narrative will reveal exactly why Moses was on the verge of death and why Moses and his wife also knew why Moses was on the verge of death. So Zipporah does something, again, weird. Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin. All right? Yeah. That's gross. That's bloody. Like, what? What's going on here? And touched Moses' feet with it. I told you it was going to get weird, okay? Like everyone's like, what is happening? Like, this is the Bible. Isn't the Bible awesome? But you got to understand, in this culture, what was going on. So she touches Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." And so what's God's response? When Zipporah does that, what does God do? So he let him alone. God let him alone. So the imagery is that God's coming to kill Moses. Zipporah circumcises her son, lays a foreskin on Moses' feet, and then God backs off. That's the image. It was then that she said, "A bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. So what's going on here? The big point is this: that when God calls, he expects absolute obedience. Where had Moses not been obedient? In the circumcision of his son. Why was that so important to God? If you go back to Genesis chapter 17, and I don't have time to go there, but if you have time to go to Genesis 10 to 14, we're going to go back to Abraham. What does God command Abraham to do as a sign of his covenant? Circumcision. As a sign that you are in a covenantal relationship with me, the male children will be circumcised as an identification that you are my covenant people. Now, why circumcision? Why this? So Zipporah, knowing, and Moses knowing that God had commanded to Abraham, this is what is to be done as a sign of my covenant. Moses had obviously refused to do that. And God coming to kill Moses, perhaps Moses says to Zipporah, "Hey, it's because we haven't circumcised our son." She goes and she does the circumcision, and it's painful and it's bloody. But they obey God. And basically she comes and she takes this foreskin and she puts it on his feet. And I think in frustration and anger and disgust over what had happened, basically says, "You serve a violent God and you have a bloody religion." And that's the reality. So why was circumcision so important? Why the cutting? Why the blood? You see, when we look at the Old Testament types and shadows, we have to understand ultimately what they point to in Christ. Because what we find in the book of Romans is that circumcision was important to God because of what it pointed to and what it represented. See, what Paul will say in Romans is that you're not a Jew simply because you've been a Jew born into the Jewish line and you've been circumcised. But circumcision, rather, what circumcision was in the Old Covenant, what circumcision was with the covenant made with Abraham, was something that pointed to what Christ would do when he takes someone and he cuts away the old and he gives them a new heart. And that one who has really been circumcised it's a circumcision of what Paul calls the heart. That the old has been cut away, that the new has been given, and that there is an identification with me because of what I have done inwardly in your heart. And God gave this sign of the covenant to Abraham and commanded Moses and commanded the Israelites, this is to be done. If it is not done, then you will be cut off. And so the language of cutting and being cut off is covenantal. That if you don't obey me in this, you will be cut off. But what Christ would do, this whole idea of circumcision is a picture of what Christ does when he saves someone, when he transforms them, when he gives them a new life, when he gives them a new heart. The old has been cut off and the new has been given. That's what circumcision ultimately points to. So you better believe this was important to the heart of God. And God says, do this. Otherwise, you'll be cut off. And even the language in Genesis when he talks to Abraham is anyone who does not do this, they will be cut off. So when God comes to Moses ready to kill him, God is taking it seriously. And God expects obedience. God expects obedience. God doesn't mess around. Like I said, he's not about lollipops and rainbows. He is a God who is jealous for his will and his mission and his purpose. And he will see that it's done, but that it's done his way. So the idea of circumcision and the cutting and the bleeding ultimately points us to how serious sin is, right? That for us to be saved and be given a new heart, Christ himself had to be cut off as he hung on the cross, the Lamb of God, cut off from his Father, so that we could be given a new heart. That he took the curse. And as he bled, and as he received the curse, it was so that we could be given a new heart, a new life, a new beginning. And that act of circumcision, that sign of the covenant God made with Abraham, pointed to Christ and him being cut off for us. That's why it was important. That's why God took it seriously. That's why Zipporah was right when she said, it is a bloody religion. Because without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. This is what sin does. This is what your sin does. It creates a need for Christ to shed his blood. But Christ, in shedding his blood, being cut off, now can give you a new heart and a new beginning. And so when Moses finally obeys, what happens? The Lord said to Aaron, go into the wilderness to meet Moses. So he went and met him on the mountain, and God kissed him, and Moses told Aaron all his words. Verse 29, then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people. And what happened? The people believed. And when they had heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that God had seen their affliction, what happened? They bowed their heads and they worshiped. And so obedience to God's call will bring blessing. May not always be easy, it may be difficult, but it will bring blessing. Because ultimately, God's glory is displayed through what? Through using weak vessels. And as we, as a church, look at what God's called us to do, there's two things. There's a corporate calling, right? As a body, we're called to make disciples. We're called to engage in this mission of reaching people far from Christ and teaching them to follow him. It will happen as you live open-handedly. What's in your hand? As a body of believers, what's God calling us to do? We as a body come together and we obey the call of God. We give what we have, we answer the call, and we allow God to take the little that we have and use it exponentially. And then there's a second aspect of it. There's an individual calling. What is it that God's calling you to now in this moment today? What need is there? What opportunity is there? As we talk about making disciples, as we talk about living in relationship with one another, this is what God's calling you as an individual to. God's calling you to this. And you can have 1,000,001 reasons why you shouldn't. But there's a God in heaven who comes to you today and says, hey, open up your hands, give to me what I can use, and then watch God blow you away with how he can use you to accomplish amazing things for his glory. Because God delights. Listen, how many of you are weak? How many of you have struggles? How many of you aren't adequate enough? Right? You're just the type of person God says, come. I want to use you. Obey me. Obey me. But I'll use you. Because God delights in using weak vessels so that his power and his glory may be displayed through them.